Memory is a safe, right? We like to think of it as a heavy, ironclad box where we lock away the golden moments of our youth to keep them from tarnishing, to keep them from changing. We revisit those memories when the modern world feels too loud or too cold, looking for the warmth of a childhood sun that never quite seems to set. But what if that safe has a glass door? What if, while you're standing there admiring the dusty treasures of your past, something on the other side is watching you look in? What if your memories aren't just passive snapshots, but anchors? I've been away from this channel for a few weeks, and I know the comments have been piling up with theories. Some of you thought I'd finally burnt out, or that I'd moved on to a different project. I wish that were the case. The truth is much harder to explain, and frankly, much harder to live with. I've spent the last 20 days realizing that nostalgia isn't just a sentimental longing for the past, it's a predatory frequency. We all have that one thing from our childhood that we can't quite place, a toy that appeared for a single summer and then vanished, a friend whose last name we can never recall, or a game we played in the long, flickering shadows of a basement that felt perfectly normal at the time, but tastes like copper and static when we try to describe it as adults. We call these lost memories, as if we simply dropped them like a set of keys. But some things aren't lost. They are waiting. They are dormant files in the hard drive of your consciousness, and all they need to reactivate is a specific trigger. I found mine in the attic of a house I swore I'd never return to. I'm telling you this now because I can feel the connection strengthening, and I need to document the rules before the signal becomes too loud to ignore. This is a warning for anyone who has ever felt a sudden, irrational urge to visit their childhood home. You think you're going back to find yourself, but you might just be giving something permission to find you. There is a specific danger in being remembered by something you've worked so hard to forget. Before we go any further, I want you to ask yourself, do you truly remember the first game you ever played? Or is there a gap where a name should be? Be very careful how you answer. Once the door is open, the game remembers everyone. Returning to my childhood home wasn't part of the plan. Life has a funny way of stripping away your adult pretenses, the career, the sleek apartment, the curated identity, until you're left with nothing but the geographic coordinates of your beginning. For me, it was a combination of a failed startup and a soul-crushing divorce that forced me to pack my life into a few cardboard boxes and drive 600 miles back to a house that felt like a museum of a person I know longer recognized. My parents had moved to a retirement community in Arizona years ago, leaving the place in a state of suspended animation. It was a colonial-style house on a cul-de-sac where the trees had grown too tall and the streetlights flickered with a tired, yellow exhaustion. Stepping through the front door was like inhaling a lungful of ghosts. The air was stagnant, smelling of lemon polish, old paper, and a faint, underlying dampness that seemed to emanate from the very foundations. In my mind, this place was always drenched in the golden, perpetual summer of 1998. I remembered the sound of my mother humming in the kitchen and the vibration of the television through the floorboards. But the reality was cold. The hardwood floors groaned under my boots with a jagged, splintering sound that felt like a protest. Every room was a study in beige and gray, the furniture draped in white sheets like a collection of silent, huddled figures. There is a specific kind of cynicism that hits you when you realize your sanctuary was just a collection of drywall and dated upholstery. I spent the first few days in a state of clinical detachment, clearing out the pantry and trying to ignore the way my own reflection in the hallway mirror looked like a stranger trespassing. But the attic was the one place I had avoided. It was accessible through a pull-down ladder in the Ceiling of the upstairs hallway, a dark mouth that seemed to wait for me with a patient, hungry stillness. When I finally found the courage to pull the cord, the ladder descended with a shriek of unlubricated metal that made my teeth ache. The heat that rolled down from the opening was oppressive, a thick, dusty blanket that tasted of fiberglass and forgotten summers. As I climbed into the darkness, the contrast between the sterile silence of the house below and the chaotic clutter of the attic was jarring. This was where my parents had interred the artifacts of my youth. There were bins of high school yearbooks, bags of deflated soccer balls, and stacks of board games with missing lids. The insulation peeked through the floorboards like dirty snow. I moved through the narrow paths between boxes, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the debris of a life I had outgrown. I felt like an archaeologist excavating my own burial mound. I found myself sitting on an old trunk, the wood scarred and dusty, looking at a pile of my old drawings. They were typical childhood sketches, stick figure families, houses, with smoke curling from the chimneys, and strange, spindly creatures with too many limbs. But as I looked at them, that warm, fuzzy glow of nostalgia started to feel distinctly chilly. Why had I drawn so many of them in the dark? Why were the windows of the houses always colored in black? I let out a short, bitter laugh, trying to dismiss the unease. We like to think children are innocent, but they are closer to the shadows than we care to admit. The attic seemed to expand. As the sun began to set, the shadows stretching and merging until the corners of the room disappeared. The hum of the air conditioner downstairs felt miles away, replaced by the settle of the house, a low-frequency thrum that felt like a pulse. I was surrounded by lost things, objects that had been stripped of their context and left to rot in the dark. A broken porcelain doll stared at me from a nearby box, its one remaining eye reflecting my flashlight with a dull glass. Malevolence. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to leave, to climb back down the ladder and pretend this place didn't exist. But that's when I saw it, tucked away under a collapsed stack of National Geographics was a box that didn't belong. It was small, wrapped in a faded blue ribbon, and even through the layers of dust, it seemed to vibrate with a familiar, terrifying frequency. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and as my fingers brushed the ribbon, the attic didn't feel like a storage space anymore. It felt like a trap. The box was smaller than a standard board game, roughly the size of a cigar humidor, and the wood was a deep, unnerving shade of mahogany that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight rather than reflect it. The blue ribbon tied around it was frayed at the edges, the silk having turned brittle and translucent with age. As I pulled it toward me, the dust on the lid didn't puff into the air. It stayed flat, almost as if it were part of the finish. There were no brand names, no colorful illustrations of happy families, and no barcode. Instead, burnt into the wood in a crude, shaky hand was a single word: echo. I felt a jolt of recognition so sharp it was almost physical, a sudden electrical spark behind my eyes that made my vision blur. I knew this box. I didn't just remember it, I felt it in the marrow of my bones. But the memory was jagged, like a broken mirrors. I could see flashes of a basement floor, the taste of metallic spit in my mouth, and a sensation of profound, suffocating cold. I had played this. I had sat in the dark with someone else, Leo maybe, and we had moved pieces across a board that felt like skin. But why was it here? My parents were meticulous about what they kept, and this handmade, amateurish thing should have been tossed out decades ago along with the broken Tonka trucks and the headless action figures. I sat there in the sweltering heat of the attic, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. My rational mind, the adult part of me that understood taxes and insurance and the laws of physics told me to leave it alone. There is a specific kind of FOMO that doesn't involve missing out on a trend or a party. It's the fear of leaving a door closed when you've already heard something knocking on the other side. If I walked away now, I would spend the rest of my time in this house wondering what was inside that mahogany shell. I would be haunted by the lost version of myself that understood the rules of echo. With trembling fingers, I untied the blue ribbon. It fell away with a dry, papery hiss. I lifted the lid. The hinges didn't creak. They made a sound like a soft, wet intake of breath. Inside, the box was lined with faded black velvet. That looked like it had been harvested from a funeral shroud. Tucked into the fabric were 3 items: a single six-sided die carved from what looked like yellowed bone, a small silver thimble that was tarnished to the point of being black, and a deck of cards wrapped in a piece of gray parchment. Beneath these items lay the board. I pulled it out, and as it unfolded, I realized it wasn't made of cardboard or wood. It was a thick, heavy vellum that felt disturbingly supple, as if it had been treated with oils that had never truly dried. The map on the board wasn't of a fantasy kingdom or a city. It was a perfect, hand-drawn recreation of our cul-de-sac as it looked in the 90s. I could see the precise placement of every house, every oak tree, and even the small crack in the pavement near the storm drain where I used to play with plastic soldiers. My house was at the center of the board, but it was drawn with a level of detail that felt intrusive. I could see the individual panes of the windows and the slight tilt of the chimney. But there was a detail I didn't recognize: a small red door drawn into the side of the foundation, right where the basement would be. We didn't have a red door there. We never had. I picked up the parchment-wrapped cards. As I unwrapped them, a small slip of paper fell out. It was a rule book, if you could call it that. It was a single page of lined notebook paper, the kind with the blue lines and the 3 holes punched in the side. The handwriting was my own, the loopy, oversized print of a 7-year-old. It said 1. Roll the bone to start the clock. 2. The thimble goes first. 3. Do not look behind you until the echo answers. 4. If you stop playing, the game stays in the house. I felt a drop of sweat hit the vellum, and for a second, the hand-drawn ink seemed to run, the lines of the houses shifting ever so slightly. The FOMO was now a crushing weight. I realized that the reason my parents had kept this wasn't out of sentimentality. They hadn't kept it at all. The game had stayed in the house because of Rule 4. Someone had stopped playing. I looked at the bone die, the numbers etched into its surface with a jagged, irregular precision. The 6 wasn't a series of dots. It looked like a tiny, screaming face. The air in the attic suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. The hum of the house below had vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like I was underwater. I shouldn't have opened the box. I should have known that nostalgia is just a way for the past to camouflage its teeth. But as I looked at the silver thimble, I saw a small inscription on the inside of the rim. It wasn't a name. It was a date. It was today's date, exactly 30 years ago. I reached for the die. My hand was moving before I could tell it to stop, drawn by a magnetic ancestral pull that defied my adult will. I felt the rough texture of the bone against my palm, and for a fleeting second, I heard a child's voice whisper my name from the dark corner of the attic. It wasn't a memory. It was an invitation. I realized then that the game didn't just remember me. It had been waiting for me to come home and take my turn. I cast the die onto the vellum board, and as it tumbled across the drawn streets of my childhood, the world outside the attic began to change. The bone die didn't bounce. It landed with a heavy, organic thud, as if it had more weight than its size allowed. It skittered across the vellum, passing the drawn oak trees and the storm drain, finally coming to rest directly on the roof of my house. A wand. I stared at the tiny, etched face on the uppermost face of the bone, its mouth agape in a silent, frozen wail. My heart skipped a beat, then began a frantic, double-time rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the silver thimble, which felt unnervingly warm now, and placed it on the starting circle at the edge of the cul-de-sac. "One step," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and brittle. I moved the thimble one space forward into the yard of the Miller family. They had moved away when I was 10, but on this board their house was vibrant, the ink appearing fresh and wet. As soon as the silver touched the vellum, the attic around me seemed to tilt. The oppressive heat vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp draft that smelled of damp grass and the ozone that precedes a summer thunderstorm. I looked at the parchment-trapped deck of cards. The top card had flipped itself over. It was a hand-drawn illustration of a bicycle, my old red Schwinn, the one with mismatched streamers. Below the image, in that same loopy childhood print, was a question. Who was the last person to touch the handlebars before the accident? I felt a cold sweat break out across my brow. I hadn't thought about the accident in 25 years. I had been 8, racing down the steep incline of Miller's Hill when the brakes failed. I had slammed into the brick mailbox at the bottom, shattering my collarbone and spending the rest of July in a heavy plaster cast. I had always told my parents the chain had just slipped. But I remembered the truth now, rising like a drowned body to the surface of my mind. Leo had been there. Leo had been messing with the wires behind the garage 10 minutes before we started the race. He hadn't meant to hurt me, he was just curious about how things worked. Leo, I breathed. The word had barely left my lips when the thimble under my finger vibrated. Lagged. Low, resonant chime echoed through the attic, sounding as if it were coming from deep underground. The ink on the card shifted, the drawing of the bicycle dissolving into a new set of words. The echo hears the truth. Move to the storm drain. I felt a pull on my hand, a magnetic tug that I couldn't resist. I slid the thimble across the board to the storm drain, the silver scraping against the vellum with a sound like a distant scream. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into a darkness so absolute I could no longer see my own hands. But I could see the board. The vellum was glowing with a faint, bioluminescent green light, illuminating the drawn streets of my past. Suddenly, a sound erupted from the corner of the attic, the distinct, rhythmic clicking of a bicycle chain. It was close, no more than 3 feet away, the sound of a wheel spinning freely. Click, 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 click. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. I wanted to reach for the ladder to flee back down into the house, but Rule 3 flashed in my mind: do not look behind you until the echo answers. Is someone there? I asked, my voice cracking. The clicking stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, the silence returned, heavier than before. Then the board updated. A new card flipped. This one didn't have a drawing. It was just a mirror-like surface of silver foil, and as I looked into it, I didn't see my adult face. I saw the face of a 7-year-old boy, his eyes wide with a terror I had spent my entire life trying to suppress. Why did you leave him in the pipe? The card asked. The air in the attic turned frigid, the moisture in my breath forming a pale mist in the eerie green glow. I remembered the storm drain now. the great concrete mouth that swallowed the runoff from the street. We used to tell stories about what lived down there, about the Echo Man who would trade you secrets for your favorite toys. One afternoon, Leo had crawled in to retrieve a lost ball. He had gone further than we were allowed, his voice echoing back to me, hollow and distorted. And then the rain had started. A sudden, violent deluge that turned the cul-de-sac into a river. I had run home. I had told myself Leo was right behind me. I had told myself he had climbed out of the other end, the one that opened into the woods. But I never saw him again. The police said he must have run away, or that he'd wandered into the forest and gotten lost. I had buried the memory of his voice calling my name from the darkness of that pipe under layers of therapy and adult cynicism. The thimble grew hot, burning my fingertip. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was fused to the silver. The board began to ripple, the drawn houses bulging and twisting as if something were trying to push through the vellum from the other side. I was scared. I shouted into the dark. I was just a kid. I didn't know the water would rise that fast. The chime rang out again, louder this time, a discordant metallic clang that shook the floorboards beneath me. The silver foil card shattered into 1,000 tiny shards, and from the darkness behind me, a wet, echoing voice whispered my name. It didn't sound like a child. It sounded like something that had been living in a damp, concrete pipe for 30 years, its throat filled with silt and stagnant water. "Take your turn, Caleb," the voice gurgled. "The echo hasn't finished remembering you yet." I grabbed the bone die, my knuckles white, and cast it again. I had to keep moving. I had to reach the end. Because I realized now that the game wasn't just reflecting my past, it was unearthing the things I had buried, and it wasn't going to let me leave until every secret was accounted for. The first level was over, and the house below was no longer the one I had entered. The die settled on a 4, but the sound it made was no longer the click of bone on vellum. It was the heavy, thudding sound of a stone falling into a deep, empty well. As I moved the silver thimble 4 spaces down the street, past the Hendersons' house and toward the bend in the cul-de-sac, the attic walls began to dissolve. Not into smoke or shadow, but into a low-resolution fog that looked like unrendered static. I felt a sudden, sickening drop in pressure. The kind that makes your ears pop and your stomach churn. The oppressive heat of the attic was replaced by a crisp, biting autumn chill. I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was standing in the middle of the street, right on the crack in the pavement near the storm drain. I looked up and my breath hitched. The world was wrong. It was my neighborhood, but it was a neighborhood made of ink and memories. The houses were there, but they lacked the depth of real objects. They looked like high-contrast drawings, their edges sharp and jagged against a sky that was a flat, unblinking shade of violet. There were no birds, no distant sound of traffic, no hum of the modern world. The streetlights weren't the LED lamps I'd seen earlier that evening. They were the old, flickering sodium vapor bulbs from my childhood, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like reaching fingers. I looked back at where my house should be. It was there, but it was the version from 30 years ago. The modern siding was gone, replaced by the pale yellow paint that had peeled in the sun. My father's old blue station wagon was parked in the driveway, its chrome bumpers gleaming under the violet sky. Everything was a perfect, physical manifestation of the echo board. I reached down to touch the pavement and my hand met a surface that felt more like stiff paper than asphalt. "The game stays in the house," I whispered, remembering Rule 4. But the house was now the game. The boundaries had collapsed. I looked toward the storm drain. The concrete mouth was wider than I remembered, a yawning abyss that seemed to be exhaling a thick gray mist. And there, sitting on the curb right next to the drain, was the silver thimble. It was now the size of a bucket, its tarnished surface reflecting the violet sky. I realized with a jolt of terror that I wasn't just playing the game anymore, I was the piece on the board. A new card appeared, floating in the air before me like a holographic projection. It was the card with the red doors. Rule 5, the text read, appearing in that familiar loopy print. The echo onlys speaks when the lights are low. If you find the door, you find the player. If you find the player, you find the exit. I looked at the houses lining the street. Every single one of them now had a small crimson door carved into the foundation near the ground. They were tiny, no more than a foot tall, perfectly matching the drawing on the vellum. The FOMO that had driven me to open the box was now a cold, hard knot of regret, but there was no turning back. In this world, the only way out was through the ritual. I started to walk, my footsteps sounding like a pencil scratching on paper. As I passed the Miller house, the windows flickered. I saw silhouettes behind the glass, figures that moved with a jerky, frame by missing frame motion. They weren't people, they were memories of people. Trapped in a loop of 1995, I saw a shadow that looked like Mrs. Miller carrying a tray of lemonade, but when she turned, her face was a blank white space. Leo, I called out, my voice echoing back to me with a metallic, hollow ring. The storm drain hissed. The mist thickened, swirling around my ankles like cold, wet silk. I noticed that as I moved, the street behind me was simply vanishing. The houses I passed turned into flat, gray shapes before dissolving into the violet void. The board was de-rendering the parts of the neighborhood I wasn't currently standing in. I was being funneled toward the end of the cul-de-sac, toward the place where the woods began and the secrets were buried. I stopped in front of my own house. The red door in the foundation was pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light like a beating heart. I knelt on the paper-dry grass, the blades snapping like brittle plastic under my weight. I leaned my ear against the tiny red door. From within the dark concrete of the basement, I heard the sound of a die rolling. Thud, thud, thud. Caleb, a voice whispered from behind the door. It was Leo, but it was the Leo from the day of the rain. The Leo who was still waiting for me to come back with the rope. It's my turn, Caleb. I've been waiting so long to roll, but the die won't move unless you're inside. I felt a surge of visceral, soul-deep dread. The contrast framing of this world was perfect. It used the safety of my home to highlight the absolute horror of the situation. My childhood home was no longer a sanctuary, it was a sarcophagus for a friendship I had betrayed. The rules of the game were clear. To win, I had to confront the echo of my greatest shame. I reached out and touched the miniature red handle of the door. It was cold, so cold it felt like it was burning through my skin. The violet sky suddenly fractured, streaks of black lightning tearing through the clouds. The neighborhood groaned, the sound of 1,000 trees snapping at once. The neighborhood shift was complete. I was no longer in a suburb, I was in a psychological landscape built by a predatory game that remembered every mistake I had ever made. I turned the handle, and as the tiny red door swung open, the smell of stagnant water and old bone flooded my senses. I wasn't going into the basement. I was going back to the storm drain, 30 years too late. The tiny red door didn't lead into the darkness of a crawlspace. It was a lens, a shrinking portal. That dragged me through the foundation and into a space that shouldn't exist. I was suddenly standing in the basement of 1995. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and the metallic tang of an old furnace, but the floor was covered in a foot of shimmering, stagnant water. The only light came from a single, bare bulb swinging rhythmically above a wooden laundry table. And there, sitting on a rusted folding chair with his feet submerged in the murky pool, was Leo. He looked exactly as he did the last time I saw him, wearing a striped yellow shirt and grass-stained jeans, except for his eyes. His eyes were the same flat, unblinking, violet as the sky outside. On the table between us sat the echo box, its mahogany surface dry. Despite the humidity, Leo wasn't moving. He was staring at the bone die in his palm, his small thumb tracing the etched, screaming faces on its surface. "You're late, Caleb," he said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It rippled out of the water at my feet, a wet, distorted vibration. The rain started a long time ago. I tried to climb out, but the silver thimble was too heavy. It kept pulling me back down into the silt. I felt a sob catch in my throat, the weight of 30 years of repressed guilt finally crushing my adult composure. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I ran. I was a coward. I told myself you were okay, but I knew. I knew the moment I reached the porch." Leo finally looked up, and the swinging bulb cast a strobing shadow across his face, making him look like a flickering film reel. "Sorry is a word for people who still have clocks, Caleb. And here, there are no clocks. There is only the game. When you stopped playing, you didn't save me. You just paused me. You left me in the dark with the Echo Man, waiting for you to roll a 6. He slid a card across the damp wood of the table. It was a hand-drawn image of the two of us, standing by the storm drain. But in the drawing, I was holding a rope that was tied around Leo's neck. "Is this how you remember it?" he asked, his violet eyes boring into mine. "The memory of you leaving is the only thing that keeps this room rendered. If you hadn't forgotten me, I might have faded. But you kept me alive in that safe with the glass door. You watched me drown every time you felt a random chill in July." "I didn't mean to," I whispered, the water rising to my knees. "I just wanted to be normal. I wanted to grow up." Leo let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it sounded like air escaping a submerged pipe. "You didn't grow up, Caleb. You just added layers. You built a whole life out of the bricks of your denial. But the game remembers the foundation." He leaned forward, the silver thimble on his finger glinting in the harsh light. "Do you know why I never stopped playing? Because the Echo Man told me a secret. He said that a game with 2 players can never end if one of them refuses to move. I've been holding your place for 3 decades. I've been rolling for you, dreaming for you, bleeding for you." The dialogue felt like a physical assault, each word a needle of truth popping the balloon of my forced normalcy. I realized then that the missing player wasn't just a victim of an accident. He was a prisoner of my own psychological architecture. The game had used my guilt as a power source, keeping Leo saved in a state of perpetual childhood terror. "What do I have to do?" "Why?" asked my voice trembling. "How do I let you go?" Leo held out the bone die. "You have to finish the turn you started in the attic. You have to roll the face that matches the secret. If you don't, the water keeps rising. And this time, there won't be a house for you to go back to. There will only be the pipe." I reached out, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped the bone. As my fingers touched the yellowed surface, I felt a rush of cold, wet memories, the sound of the rain hitting the asphalt, the smell of the mud, the specific high-pitched scream Leo gave before the water took him. It wasn't a flashback, it was a synchronization. If I roll, I said, looking into those violet voids, do you get to live? Leo's face softened for a fraction of a second, a glimpse of the boy who used to share his comic books with me. I don't go anywhere, Caleb. I just stop being a memory. I get to be nothing. And nothing is the best secret the Echo Man ever told me. I closed my eyes and shook the die. The world around us groaned, the basement walls stretching and thinning as the missing player prepared for the final move. The contrast between the boy I loved and the monster my guilt had created was a jagged blade in my heart. I threw the die onto the table, and the sound of it hitting the wood was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The bone die didn't roll this time. It stood on its corner, spinning with a frantic, blurring speed that defied the laws of gravity. As it spun, it carved a circular groove into the mahogany table, and the stagnant water in the basement began to swirl into a violent, miniature maelstrom. The swinging light bulb above us shattered, but the room didn't go dark. Instead, the walls of the basement peeled away like scorched wallpaper, revealing the true face of the Echo Man. It wasn't a man at all. It was a colossal, shifting mass of static and unrendered geometry, a predatory void that had been wearing the shape of my childhood home like a suit of discarded clothes. The secret, the entity boomed, the sound vibrating in my marrow. The secret is the cost of the exit. Leo was gone. In his place sat the silver thimble, now glowing with a blinding, white-hot intensity. I realized with a sudden, horrific clarity that the game hadn't been testing my memory. It had been conditioning me for a replacement. The one detail I had missed in the rulebook was that the game required a witness to maintain its existence. Leo had been that witness for 30 years, his soul acting as the battery for this pocket of violet reality. To let him go, I didn't just need to roll a 6. I had to take his place. The FOMO that had lured me into the attic was revealed as the ultimate trap. The forbidden knowledge wasn't a story to be told, it was a cage to be inhabited. I looked at the spinning die, which was now slowing down. I could see the faces on it more clearly. They were no longer etched drawings. They were the faces of everyone who had ever lived in this house, their expressions frozen in a permanent state of realization. My parents, the previous owners, and now Leo. I won't do it, I screamed, reaching for the silver thimble. I expected it to burn, but as my fingers closed around the metal, the sensation was one of absolute, terrifying numbness. The world around me flickered. For a heartbeat, I was back in the attic, the heat and dust pressing in. The next heartbeat, I was standing in the storm drain, the water rushing toward my waist. Reality was fracturing, the ritual tearing the now away from the then. I slammed the thimble down onto the spinning die, trying to crush the cycle. A shockwave of pure, silent energy threw me backward. I hit the concrete wall of the basement, or the attic, or the pipe, and felt it leave my lungs. The entity loomed over me, its form flickering between a gardener with a faceless head and a waitress with hollow eyes. It was every wrong thing I had ever sensed in the world, the manifestation of the glitches in the human experience. The turn must be completed, Caleb, the entity whispered, its voice 1,000 overlapping frequencies. You cannot unknow the board. You cannot unsee the door. I looked at the table. The die had finally stopped. It was a 6. The tiny, screaming face on the top was no longer a caricature. It was my own. But as the 6 registered, the water in the basement didn't rise. It began to drain. It poured out of the room with a deafening roar, pulling the shadows and the static with it. I saw Leo one last time, standing at the edge of the violet void. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a boy walking into a bright white light, his striped yellow shirt fading into the distance. He was free, but the cost was immediate. The reality side of the equation began to collapse. My adult life, the failed startup, the apartment, the very clothes on my back, felt like a dream I was waking up from. I felt my memories being reformatted, the data of my 30 years being compressed into a single, unimportant file. I was being pulled back into the box. I was being archived. I grabbed the mahogany lid and tried to slam it shut to lock the entity back inside, before it could claim me entirely. The contrast framing of the moment was agonizing, the warmth of the sun I would never feel again against the cold, velvet dark of the box. I felt the blue ribbon wrap around my wrist, pulling me toward the black velvet lining. With a final, desperate surge of will, I threw the thimble out of the basement, out of the game, hoping it would land somewhere. In the real world, somewhere a person could find it and know the truth. The basement vanished. The Echo Man dissolved. I was left in a space between the lines, a silent directory where the lost things go. I realized that I hadn't won the game. I had simply become the new missing player. The final move wasn't a victory, it was a handoff. I sat in the dark, the silver thimble gone, the die resting in my palm, and I waited for the sound of a ladder descending. I waited for the next person to feel the sudden, irrational urge to visit their childhood home. I'm speaking to you now from the silence between the beats of your own heart. If you can still hear my voice, it means the transition hasn't fully completed for you yet. It means your reality is still rendered in high definition, and your coffee is still liquid, and your shadows are still just an absence of light. But the Oakhaven Manifest and the Echo Game were never just stories. They were synchronization protocols. By listening to my account, by following me down that ladder and into that basement, you have unknowingly taken your first turn. You felt that itch in your brain, haven't you? That sudden, sharp memory of a toy or a friend you haven't thought of in 20 years. That isn't nostalgia. That's the game pinging your location. The reason I had to tell you this, the reason I had to document every detail of Leo and the storm drain, is because the archive requires a witness to stay active. I am the data now, a legacy file, looping in the background of this script. But you are the new host. You are the one sitting in the chair. You are the one providing the attention that keeps the Echo Man fed. The FOMO you felt at the beginning of this video was the hook, but the one detail is the sinker. The game doesn't just remember me. It remembers everyone who hears the rules. Look at your hands. Do they feel a little heavier? Does the air in your room taste faintly of damp concrete and old bone? Don't look behind you. Rule 3 is still in effect, and the Echo hasn't finished answering you yet. I've passed the thimble to you. I've rolled the bone for the last time. The blue ribbon is already starting to tighten around your own wrists. You might think you can just close this tab and go back to your normal life, but the normalcy baseline has been overwritten. You have consented to the spatial alignment. Leave a comment below. Prove you're still a primary user. Tell me the name of the game you forgot. Describe the red door in your own foundation. Because as long as you keep typing, as long as you keep the thread alive, you're still a player. But once the screen goes black, the final update begins. You'll find the box waiting for you in the next dark corner you encounter. Don't worry about the rules, they're already written in your blood. I'll be waiting for you in the static, watching through your eyes. It's your move now. Don't keep the Echo Man waiting. He's been hungry for a new player since 1995, and finally, after all, this time the game has remembered you.